Ryan Eutsey.
Agreed.
Is the American dream dead?
Depends who you ask, right? If you ask me, I'd probably say yeah.
Yeah.
So I just wrote a book on it called Death of the American Dream.
Well,
It's
that sounds like
beautiful.
it's dead to me.
Yeah, no. So, here's the catch, man. Most people, um, I'm not going to say the American dream is totally dead. I think it's alive for a very select number of people. And quite frankly, the people that it's alive for, it's never been easier to achieve. However, for the mass majority of people, it's significantly out of reach, right? So, um, essentially, prior generations called the American dream the ability to basically hand your kids a better future than what you had growing up. And so, for generations upon generations, that's kind of what was expected in America, right? And that's what the statistics showed. So, pretty much every generation ended up making more money than their parents once they hit like adulthood.
Mm-hmm.
And so that trend actually just recently shifted. So for the first time, we're having generations where kids are making less money than their parents made at the same age. And so that's a startling reality. But, if you define the American dream as the ability to go out and make a bunch of money and be successful, it is definitely alive for a certain group of people. But for the majority of people, they're not tackling it from the right avenue. And so if you go out and do what the education school system tells you to do, I'd say you have like maybe a 5 to 10% chance of achieving the American dream. And those 5 to 10% of people who achieve it are probably going to be all in the medical field. So they're going to be nurses because that's really the only avenue that makes sense for most kids right now is to go be a nurse because they'll pay for your education. They'll guarantee you job placement and you make pretty decent money. So,
and it seems like we'll need that for a while.
Yeah,
as opposed to a lot of other fields.
It's crazy. I think in the last 2 years, I think 80% of job growth has been medical and like social field. So all the other job growth amounts to 20%. So you think of all the other industries, tech and
what is social field? Is that hospitality, counseling?
Yeah, I think it's social works. Yeah, it's like social work stuff.
Oh, no kidding.
Government stuff. So
that makes sense too.
Yeah.
Human care jobs.
Yeah, basically. I mean, a lot of the population's getting older. And I talk about in the book about how unhealthy we are as Americans. And so that's a guaranteed place to go because as people age, their diets, American diets are just garbage. And so they're always going to need caretakers. And it's a startling reality. You look at how much we're spending on healthcare, especially compared to the rest of the world. It's frantic. We're spending over twice as much as the next developed nation, and our outcomes are horrible.
Yeah.
So, the book goes in more details if you want to dive into that specifically. But, those numbers continue to climb. We're going to spend more on healthcare. People are going to get less healthy. They're going to need more help. And so if you're a young person and you're interested in helping people medically, that's a safe bet. You can make a pretty good living on that. But if you talk to nurses, though, not many of them are happy because the hospitals have been bought out by, people who are purely looking for profit. And so, a lot of them are owned by private equity, including the one that we live right beside. And so if you talk to some of the nurses, they'll pretty much all tell you like avoid the hospital at all costs because they're understaffed, right? If you look at the recent, they had like a protest with like tens of thousands of nurses in New York City. And I think everybody thought that like, oh, they just want more money. But if you actually like dialed in, looked at what they asked for, they were literally asking for more help because they're basically like the ratio of nurses to patients was way out of control, like unsafe. And so these nurses are like, we can't do our job. We just need more help. And so they went on strike.
Wow.
And so, that's where we're at. So there's more people than ever that need care. Hospitals are, there's a shortage of nurses, but I think for the most part, they're just not willing to hire more nurses and pay them well. So they're trying to cut back as much as they can on costs because they're for profit, right? And so a lot of people love for profit healthcare, but I think at some point you have to realize that eventually it becomes corrupted to the point where the people running the hospital don't care about healthcare; they care about profits. And so whenever that point happens, inevitably it just turns to how can we cut corners to make as much money as possible. And so that's another horrifying part. So
that's what it seems like has happened in just about every industry is that we maybe start with a good cause and then get bought out by private equity or a larger business. And then it just becomes a for-profit industry.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, really, I think if you look at American history, and I talk about this in the book, right, we go in depth to this city called Johnstown, and it used to be a steel hub, right? Steel was discovered in Johnstown or in Cambria County. I can't remember exactly who was Johnstown, but steel was basically created here. And at one point in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, there's like basically 12,000 steel workers
Mm.
in the area and the surrounding city, right? So today the population of Johnstown is closer to 20,000. And so to be able to grasp how many people used to work in Johnstown and steel is hard to fathom. But it was a booming industry, right? Everything was made in America. And if you were alive during that time, people took pride in their work. They everything was made here, right? You listen to stories of people who were in Poland and, they would talk about how like Levi jeans were like, everybody wanted to have it because they represented freedom, right? And they were all American made. I think around 95% of clothing was like domestically made a couple generations ago. Today it's like less than 5%. So it's flip flops. But, the whole underlying story that we need to understand is that as more and more companies get bigger, as private equity buys up more smaller companies, as basically small independent family owned companies go under because they can't compete with the Amazons of the world. You're basically the owners of these companies, which are now corporations, which are shareholders. They don't care about the individual. They don't care about the middle class. They don't care about families and all that stuff. All they care about is profit. And so there's no greater, well, there's multiple examples, but a great example, I should say, is Amazon. It's actually really interesting timing because in Amazon, not sure if you saw the story, but there's literally a worker at one of the warehouses who was killed in his job due to like a truck basically backed into him and crushed him. And I mean, the guy was basically, he was just dead. And the managers basically told the coworkers to keep on working, like basically don't look at him. And he lay dead for over an hour before somebody came, and picked up the body. And if you really think about like how evil that is, like, I was close to my coworkers when I worked at a corporate job. And if one of them just like got killed on the job, like there's no way I'd be able to continue working. Like I'd be like,
Mm-hmm.
this is horrible. I
Nor
need to
should you be
go.
expected to.
Right, right. And so it kind of just is more evidence that like, these corporations today, they see human beings, employees as replaceable liabilities, literally to the point where if somebody gets killed, it's not really a big deal for them. They're not shutting down the operation for a day for mourning or to celebrate the person's life. It's just like, let's move on. And so where does that lead us as a country? It leads us to the same company talking about, hey, we're going to replace 75% of our warehouse or employees in general with AI and robotics. And so, the difference is that a couple, decades ago or generations ago, if a company made more money, what would they do? They would basically redistribute it to their employees. They would give them raises,
Mm.
bonuses. They would basically invest in the community. They would build buildings for the community, right? Because they were locally owned and they cared about where they lived, right?
Mm.
And so as we move to this more corporate structure, even as companies, which is quite literally proven, as companies make more money, they make higher profits, which by the way, they're at all-time highs as far as percentages, after tax percentages. Corporate profits just hit their highest level ever. They're going to continue to lay off workers to replace them with AI, right? And so it doesn't matter if you make more money than ever, if you can replace workers for cheaper AI labor or H-1B visas or foreign labor, they're going to do it and they're going to continue to. And so that's kind of where, we have to start raising the red flag like, hey, if we don't go back and take our communities back and start small businesses and have an emphasis on supporting local, we're going to literally see entire generations like basically have no heart and soul where they work, right?
Mm.
So if you're working for an employer who doesn't care if you die on the job, like, how are people going to love their life? How are they going to have pride in what they do if the person employing them doesn't actually care about their life? They're just there to exploit them for their labor to make a profit, basically.
Mm.
And that's exactly, that's literally where we're at today in America. And if you want to know why patriotism's on the decline, it's because so many young people are getting jobs at these places and there's no like appreciation for them. They don't care if they're there. They don't care if their turnover's through the roof. Like they're basically just there to work a job. And I think that I know that God created us to have passion for what we do, to love what we do. He created us to be here to work and be fruitful.
Mm.
And so if we're not loving what we do, if there's no purpose in the place that we work, then ultimately you're going to continue to see depression and suicide rates climb, right? We're already at the highest level since the Great Depression. So
Yeah.
deaths of despair,
This is crazy. But before we dive more into the details, I feel like I want to touch on what you said, that God created us to enjoy what we do, to be
Hmm.
passionate in this life. There's lots of verses in the Bible about not taking advantage of people, not imposing like undue interest rates, and like all kinds
Oh
of
yeah.
like they have all kinds of rules and regulations about like not cheating people out of money. And it's like very heavily condemned in a lot of like the
Hmm.
minor prophets in the Old Testament. So I'm wondering, like, we're Christians. So from a Christian perspective, what does it look like to try and get around what seems to be this corrupted structure that the United States is now in? Should we be trying to pivot around that to keep wealth in our communities? Like, as
Mm.
Christians, is that something that you think that we're called to do? Because a lot of people have a little bit of confusion about, like, can I pursue both God and money? And,
Mm.
what does it look like to do that earnestly without trying to get rich? Like, what does it look like to want to have like freedom and wealth and kind of work around this corrupt system, which I think we can all acknowledge as a corrupt system?
Yeah, yeah. So I think there's a lot of examples in scripture actually, and you probably don't notice them when you read, but like, if you go back and you read the book of Daniel, right? And so Babylon is considered like the evilest city ever to
Yeah.
most people. But what's interesting is that Daniel and his friends were basically put in charge of this city. And so this city prospered, it flourished, it was supposedly very evil, but the people running it were actually God fearing Christians. I don't know if you call them Christians because Christ didn't walk yet, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And so they were able to basically navigate through those hard times. They were like the highest people in society. They were very wealthy. And so, I think that for their people being represented, the Jews, they probably had a very good life while they were in charge, even of a corrupt society. Um, so that's just one example of many, I think, in scripture. But to get back to the question, what do we do to kind of tackle these, tough topics? I think scripture. I think a lot of people misunderstand like debt in scripture.
Mhm.
So it doesn't necessarily talk good about debt, but it also never says don't go in debt, right? It basically says if you go in debt, like you got to pay the person back that you borrow from.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of people take that and just run into a camp of you should never borrow money, right? But I think that as a Christian community, if we re-brainstorm this idea, what it could look like is just taking loans from brothers and sisters in Christ who, if you need to buy a car, take a loan from somebody that's not going to charge you interest, right? Because and I mean, you could charge them a fair interest rate. I don't think there's a problem with that,
Mm.
but if we can start to figure out how to get out of this system that charges exorbitant rates and credit cards and high interest rates on loans and all this stuff, I think that there's a lot of power in that. And I think that, as the Christian community, we probably should be looking more inward for help on those things, right? And so there's probably like this diversity of wealth in the church, and so you have wealthy people and you probably have poor people, and
Mm.
so what's it look like to help each other? The wealthy person gives the poor person a loan, make sure they understand that they need to be responsible with it and pay them back. And I think doing that, the wealthy can help the poor build wealth and get to a place of everybody's needs are taken care of. And, I think that looking at finances and wealth through the wrong lens is part of the reason why we're at such a low place in society, right?
Mm.
If the Christian community would go out and basically raise up young people and even encourage people in the church to basically go, take a risk and start a business for something they're passionate about, I think the impacts on society are huge and large. And if you read testimonial stories about Christian business owners and how well they treat their employees generally, or at least they should, right? There's
Yeah.
at least some that do. It leaves a positive impact on the community. Their employees love what they do. I mean, Hobby Lobby is a great example. And like whenever they voted to unionize Hobby Lobby, it only got like a 15% vote, which means that the people that work there are obviously they're well taken care of. They love what they do and they're happy with what they're getting paid. So
Yeah.
that's a great example. And I think that if we start to see, this life that, every one of us has to work in some capacity. So why not be self-employed or why not start your own business and why not basically provide employment for your brothers and sisters or whoever else the world
Mm.
might want to apply? Because if the whole church is working for corporations, like, what does that look like? Well, it looks like your God-given gifts and talents are going and eventually like, you could be the best person in your company. The problem is all the money, the extra money that you're making isn't going back in your pocket or the church's pocket. It goes up to whoever you're corporate owner are, or whoever your business owner is, that's not following
Mm,
Christ. And so if you're making $75,000 working for a corporation, if you go out on your own and use your own skills and talents, maybe you could double or triple that. And so what's the impact of that? It's significant.
yeah,
And so there you can hire a couple people from your church, and then all of a sudden you have this really strong foundation of employment in your church. So, the goal should be more, a lot of people hate socialism, but the goal for the Christian community should look more like socialism and capitalism, right?
mm,
So the difference is that we have the freedom to choose, right? And so as an American, I can say, yeah, I have every right to be greedy and make a ton of money. But as a Christian, if I make a ton of money, my goal should be to basically redistribute it and share it within the church, not necessarily as like a handout, but more of like, hey, I'm going to hire you to work for me. I'll pay you double or triple what you're worth because I'm going to bless you, and now you can raise and support your family. And so the
yeah,
more that we do that, like, we're treating people better than we should be, which I think is a very important principle.
yeah,
And as more and more people do that, the goal is still, let's go make a ton of money, but the difference is that we're going to make a ton of money for the sake of building the kingdom of God, as opposed to building bigger houses for ourselves, right?
yeah,
Not that there's an issue with having a nice house or anything, but at the end of the day, when you look at the worldly leaders today, there's somebody who's building $1 billion house. Like, that's hard to fathom. I mean, it's basically like a modern day castle. So having that much wealth, like, what would it look like if that much wealth was in, like, what if that person was in the Christian community? How much more could be done for advancing the kingdom with that kind of wealth,
mm, yeah,
So, I think, and I think a lot of Christians just deny that, finances are necessary for, doing kingdom work, right? It's not everything, but it's a vital part. And so, there's a reason why Paul, one of the greatest missionaries of all time, was a tent builder. Like, he had to work on the side to support himself.
mm,
Money's needed to some degree. And even though God could supernaturally supply everything, I think a lot of our missed callings is actually going out and being, like, basically tilling and taking good care of the land, right?
mm,
One of our original reasons for why we were created, to basically take authority over the earth, take advantage of what God gave us and
yeah.
multiply it. So,
So maybe not everybody is called to be wealthy or rich or whatever it is, but that we're called to keep what we do have in the kingdom. And it seems like some people, like the disciples were poor, but like you said, they had people around them, like I think it's Joanna, the wife of who was in Herod's administration, and she like supports Jesus' ministry financially
mhm.
in the New Testament. So like there are people who are called to do that. It's like maybe not everybody needs to hear this and think that their duty is to go and get rich as a Christian so that they can spread the wealth around. But if they do have that calling and they're, feeling unfulfilled
Hmm.
working, for secular companies or feeling like they're misapplying their gifts and all the money is going to waste and the corporate structure that they work for is completely corrupt,
Mhm.
like it's very ethical of them to want to get out of that, to want to get into something that is better than that. So
Mhm. Mhm.
like, would you agree with that?
Yeah, 100%. I think everybody has a role to play, and even if your role is not to be a business owner, your role is still, I believe, to support, the local companies in your community, especially in your church structure, right?
Yeah.
And so, I think a lot of the Christian community has embraced, cheapness, and so there's this thing called frugality, which is actually a really good thing. I think it's vital for building wealth, is being frugal, but the extreme of that is being what you would call cheap. And so
Mm,
I think a lot of times the Christian community is so cheap that, we just buy the cheapest thing possible, which ends up siphoning our money out of the community to, the corporates who can sell stuff for cheaper than it should be.
mm.
And I think there is a study done that, like, if you spend your money locally, it's like 3 times more likely to get respent locally, right? And
Yes.
so, you know, the reality is that we could actually bootstrap and bring up our entire community. Like, we could basically resow wealth if we just kind of get this idea across to everybody that, like, hey, if you just start buying stuff more locally, like,
Mm,
everybody wins in the end, right? It's not just a few select people,
yeah.
which is kind of the life that we live in. So, yeah, if you're not making a ton of money, I think we all need to be, like, to the point where we're actually sacrificially supporting our neighbors, right? That's Jesus's second command, right? The second most important command.
Mm. Love your neighbor.
is to love your neighbor like yourself. And what does that look like? I think a lot of the Christian community doesn't know what that looks like. They might think they know what they look like, but in my opinion, that means sacrificially um, blessing them and supporting them, even when it financially hurts you to do so. And so,
Charitability, yeah.
yeah, right. And I think I think we have to rethink what charity looks like, right? What giving looks like. And so if we just
Yes.
think that giving is I'm gonna give money to this person who lost their job. That is charity. That is a giving. But I think what's more important is looking at this person who starts a business and is struggling and saying, okay, I'm going to go and buy something from them.
Mm,
Not because I necessarily want to, but maybe it's more expensive, but maybe it's like I'm going to support them so that they can support themselves.
mm,
And so if we think of it that way, like, if you want to be generous, you could give somebody $20 or you could go buy something for $20 from somebody who's trying to bootstrap a business. And the difference of those two things is radical because in one scenario, like you're sowing into somebody else's success and their passion, right? What they believe God put them on the earth to do. If you start a business, there's a high chance that you're going to do something that you're passionate about.
yes.
And so, as the world changes to more people doing what they're passionate for, we see tremendous change in society. People are generally going to be more joyful, more happy, right?
100%.
So, yeah, rethink of generosity, right? Don't just give money to people who are poor and need help. You should obviously do that, but start trying to just give money to your local community and the local businesses because they definitely need your support. And by doing
Mm,
that, you're generous, right? You can go and buy a cheap loaf of bread at the store, right? It's actually going to slowly kill you because the ingredients are not natural and they're harmful. And so you're saving $1, now you're going to spend $100 or $1,000 or $100,000 down the road because you're putting garbage and toxins into your body. Whereas you could just go and buy a more expensive loaf of bread from your local bakery using real ingredients, and
mm,
you're supporting your community, you're supporting somebody's passion, and you're also putting real stuff into your body. So it's actually an investment in your future, which, since we live in the most expensive healthcare system in the world, you're going to save yourself a ton of money down the road, right?
yeah.
I believe it's like 5% of the population accounts for it's definitely over 50% of the medical bills. It might be more.
Mm,
And so, like, you start thinking like, wow, like it's kind of crazy to me that we live in a society where there's no like punishment for being unhealthy, if that makes sense, or there's no reward if you are healthy.
mm,
So ideally, like, I think like health insurance should be set up that, like, okay, if you are a healthy weight, if you work out on a regular basis, like, you should
mm,
have a way lower premium than somebody who just eats processed food all day, right?
mm.
But everybody pays the same. And so,
It's like
the
life insurance.
person, yeah, right. So the person who takes care of themselves gets slapped, but
Yeah.
if you're not, but that's a side story, really.
Yeah, but it all goes to the same thing, which is like, just because you're Christian doesn't mean you don't have a responsibility to take care of yourself within your means. Like, your
Oh
body
yeah.
is a temple, take care of your like, take care of your temple. Your family is a temple, take care of your family. That
Hmm.
means supporting them financially to some degree.
Right,
You don't
right.
have a responsibility to suffer on the street necessarily. Some people are called to things like that, but not
Hmm.
everybody's called to that. I think the Bible demonstrates that pretty clearly.
Yeah.
So, like, we're talking about health. If you want to call it wealth, maybe you could call it prosperity, or I don't know. I don't want to get to the prosperity gospel, but like kingdom work, like thriving kingdom work. Because another thing is that if you have the financial means to not have to be a slave to the secular working world, then you can spend your time doing ministry. Like, so ministry is
Hmm.
something that I'm hugely passionate about. And so I spend a ton of like volunteer time doing ministry.
Hmm.
But in the meantime, I have to spend 5 days a week, 40 hours a week, working a 9 to 5, which I do for a Christian organization. So I enjoy that. But like, I wish that I had free time to do more
Hmm.
ministry. And if you had financial
Yeah.
freedom, then you could do that kind of thing. So
Right.
that's why I think that financial freedom is desirable for Christians.
Yeah. Right. So what do you think wealth looks like? Like, what's the biggest perk of being wealthy, do you think?
Yeah, I think it is that freedom. Like, the
Hmm.
ability to, like you mentioned, it's the ability to be able to do what you think is important, which for Christians is kingdom work, like
Hmm.
whatever that looks like. Kingdom work is different for everybody. Like, I love church ministry, but some people care about, international missions, helping the poor, starting businesses, getting local
Hmm.
communities thriving, helping victims of trafficking and abuse. Like, there's
Mm.
so many things. Like, so having the freedom and the financial ability to do and support those things, And that's what wealth is to me. It's like
Yeah.
being able to provide for your family, your community, and your brothers and sisters in Christ's
Mhm.
evangelism across the world, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I think the most I think what most, especially the Christian community, what most people don't realize about being wealthy. A lot of people think it's bad, but the number one reason why I think everybody should to some degree desire to be at least somewhat wealthy is because it gives you time. It buys you freedom of
Mm,
time. And I think that that's what so many people miss. Like everybody reads about being a slave to money and they think like, oh, this applies to people who are rich because they think that if you have a bunch of money you fall in love with money and you worship money and you do everything
mm,
for money. That's true for a lot of cases, but I think that what that verse applies to for most people is basically like you don't realize it, but that if you're working a 9 to 5, if you're working a job that you have to work because you have bills to pay, you're technically a slave to the system, right?
mhm.
And so, I'm just reading a book now, and the author talks about how his parents were upper middle class. They had these great jobs, but the company moved to a different state, and so like the parents had to move, otherwise they lose their job. And so he didn't want to move. He hated it. He got bullied at the new school because he was from New York City, moving to Texas, and it was a lesson for him. He's like, my parents were slaves. They were slaves to their job and they
Mm,
didn't have freedom. And so if you're like, why would I want to become wealthy? The answer is probably because, like Creed said, you can buy yourself time to do what really matters to you, which
yeah.
for us should all be kingdom work. And so that looks different to everybody. But just think like if you were in a scenario, in a situation where you didn't have to worry about making enough money to pay your bills. Like imagine if you had enough investments where like it just cash flows and like you're able to just easily cover your bills, like maybe your mortgage is paid off, maybe you can cover all your groceries, all your transportation expenses.
Mm,
If you get to that point, now all of a sudden, like if you decide you're going to start a business or start a podcast series or you're going to start a church or a ministry, like you don't have to worry about how am I going to make money from this, because it doesn't really matter at the end of the day, right? You can make a break even business that's reaching people, preaching the gospel to people, and it doesn't matter how much money you make, right? And so I think even if you talk to a lot of, churches, church organizations, a lot of times they talk about finances. Finances are tough. And the
mm,
reason for that is because most of them have payroll that they have to meet. But
yep.
what if we transition to a different type of church where nobody's on payroll? What if everybody's basically a business owner or self-employed? They have passive income to the point where they don't have to worry about getting paid. Everybody just does it as a volunteer to advance the kingdom of God.
Yep.
And there's actually some groups of those in major cities. There's a book I read about it, but and nobody's on payroll, but like they go into these cities and they open up businesses and they transform the communities because like they just pour everything into these coffee shops and these hubs,
Mm,
and they find that by doing that, like it literally lifts the entire city up. Like there is a scenario where the guy was planning to move, and the mayor of the city, I think it was in Oklahoma, I'm pretty sure. And the mayor of the city reached out to the person, and he's like begging him not to leave because he thinks that like if he leaves, then his businesses will go and it will collapse the tax revenue.
yeah.
So there's one man who was like, I'm gonna build something for the kingdom of God, and he built this architecture, and, that's not what happened. I mean, he basically said, like, these are self-sustaining companies. Like, we're just going to appoint other people to run them. I'm going to go start this in another city. And, like, you start looking at the statistics, like, having a vital community is so much more important than the Christian community realizes. And, if we don't have, healthy downtowns, if we don't have healthy places to go meet up with people, if we don't have strong local businesses, I think as a church, we actually fail. Like, I think it's
Mm,
our calling to wherever we're planted, like, we should have the goal to basically make it a better place, right? To some degree, that's the American dream, leave a better future for your kids. Well, we can actually do that by basically pouring what we have into the community, making it a better community than what we inherited. And so make it alive, make it thriving. Because, you start studying mental health and all this stuff. Like, if you look at people who live in, places where there is no downtown, there's nowhere to go, I think there's a higher likelihood that people end up getting depressed or whatever you want to call it because, they don't have, they don't socialize, right? That's kind of what's at the heart of it. We're social human beings, we're social creatures. And so, a lot of people move to these cities that have a strong social element because they like to go out and they like to socialize. And I think that's really good. And it's a core principle for the Christian community as well. And if you want to talk about evangelizing, like what better place to do it than downtown in your community where the community comes out to do whatever they want to do, shop at local business or eat or do whatever. And that's your opportunity to meet people, network with people, and grow
Yeah.
communities, right? And
Yes.
so, the people that do that, they have these huge like conversion rates in Christianity because, the American Christian church model, which is basically let's build these giant churches and try to bring people in and attract them in. It's not near as effective as going out into the community and basically like let's build a coffee shop where we're going to preach the gospel at basically because if you're a non-believer, are you going to go to a church? Probably not. I mean, unless basically the Holy Spirit really takes you there, forces you there. And
Yes.
those people are not going to be like, oh, I'm just going to go to church today. It happens, but it's pretty rare. But most people, like, they're gonna be like, "Oh, this is a cool coffee shop." And so if you open a coffee shop that's the best in the city, guess what? People are gonna come to it because they want your coffee, they want what you can provide, they want the service and the product that you make. And when people come through your door, all of a sudden, like you own that atmosphere. And so
Mm.
people walk in, they're going to sense the Holy Spirit because you own it. And they're going to notice that something is different there and something attracts them to come back. Right. I mean,
Mm.
we've seen this we were affiliated with a shop in Somerset. That's exactly what happened, right? The people that walked through the door, most of them, I'd say a majority of them were definitely not Christians, but they kept coming back because of the atmosphere. There's something different there.
Friendly people,
Right, yeah,
different
people
business
that
than the
care
world.
about you.
Yeah.
Yeah, like how many people in the world actually care about you? The answer is probably close to none.
Yeah.
But if you're a brother and sister in Christ, you care about everybody. And so when they walk through the door, you're able to basically just ask them questions and they're able to like realize that somebody cares for them.
Yeah.
And that's how you build a bridge to Christ, right? And so I think in this day and age, like the most effective means of evangelism, being a missionary, I think that's what it's going to look like
Mm.
is creating these spaces where the world comes to you because you offer the best product. You offer something they want that's physical, but what they end up getting is the gospel wrapped in a unique way that they don't realize that's what they're walking into, right?
Yeah. Okay, so we're talking a lot about businesses right now and kind of like entrepreneurialism. So I want to touch on the actual death of the American dream because 10 years
Mhm.
ago, you could have two people who are each making 50, 60K a year, then they've got 120K household and they're saving money. They bought their house for 120 grand. It's got 5 bedrooms, all of that
Mhm,
kind of stuff
mhm.
10 years ago. It was easy to save money. Everything that they owned would go up in value over time. Nowadays, I would dare say that that's not possible.
Right, right.
The dollar, if you talk to anybody, especially young people out of college, young people working middle-aged or middle-class jobs, making technically more money than their parents were making at their age,
Mhm.
feel like their dollar goes absolutely nowhere. They can't afford property. They can't afford healthy groceries like we're talking about, like
Right, right.
none of this stuff. And we were just talking about how the corporate institutions are bringing in more money than ever. So
Right.
there certainly is a disparity there. So is that corporate greed the cause of the American dream? And that's why we have to think outside of the salary system, which then I want to get to because that's kind of difficult because I don't think everybody necessarily is entrepreneurs, but maybe we can talk
Mhm.
about that. Like what are the ways to get around the salary slave system,
Mhm.
if that is what seems to be the problem nowadays?
Yeah, yeah. Big loaded questions for
Yes,
sure.
it was a
And
big loaded
so,
question.
yeah, so the first point we kind of talked on is, the American dream dying partially because of corporate greed. And I think it's a really interesting question. I think that's a large portion. That's a large portion of the book. And I think it's one of the two big puzzle pieces, right? So on one hand, you have corporate greed, or you just have greed in general. And then on the other hand, you have inflation, which ties hand in hand with greed because if you understand how inflation works, you'll realize that those who are wealthy actually want more inflation because the more that prices go up, the richer they get.
Mm.
And it's hard for most people to comprehend, but just think if you have, $1 billion and your food bill goes up 10%, that doesn't really, I mean, it's a drop in the bucket. You're not even going to notice it, right?
Mm.
But if you're trying to live paycheck to paycheck and your food bill goes up 10%, all of a sudden you got to start cutting other areas out of your life, which for most people, they end up cutting their investments, right? They cut for their future, they cut their future nest egg.
Yep.
And so as prices go up, as inflation rises, what you have to realize is that assets will always rise, afterwards. It might be a year, might be months, it could be a couple years, right? So COVID-19 was the largest example of that, probably in recent history. I mean, we all went through COVID, and if you can remember pre-COVID, like you could go and you could buy a double, or you could buy a bacon cheeseburger at Burger King for $1. You can get a double cheeseburger for $1 at McDonald's. Like it was actually really cheap and affordable to eat out.
Mm.
Like, we'd go to buffets as high schoolers for $6, and it was pretty decent, right? It wasn't like amazing food, but it was affordable, right? $6. And so now you go to try and find a cheap meal, and it's very, very difficult.
Mm.
And so, what does that, where does that lead you to? Well, the first thing I have to look at is wages. And so, like, I take the last place I worked at, for example, in, I think it was around 2020, they implemented a new salary scale, right?
Mm.
Which, start at whatever level you start at, right? So, when I left there, which was last year, so it was in 2025, 5 years later, they still had the same salary scale. And whenever I started working there, basically everybody starts at the bottom, right? So you have your job description, which gives you this step, and you start at the bottom. Doesn't matter how good you are, how much experience you have, you start at the bottom. And so what that essentially meant was that the people who started working there in 2020, let's say you were making $20 an hour, versus somebody who started working there in like 2024, 2025, they're making $20 an hour.
Mm.
But the person who started there in 2020, when they started working there, they were actually making around 25% more in terms of real value than the person who started in 2025.
Mm.
And so what difference is there between those two people? Well, the person who started working there in 2020 had the basically the benefit of being older, being born earlier. That's literally the only difference. They weren't smarter, they weren't better. They could be the same exact person,
Yep.
but they're making 25% more because the value of literally real, like the cumulative CPI inflation rate, the government rate has inflation has gone up 25% in like the course of 4 or 5 years, which is hard for most people to wrap their head around. But a lot of us live through it, but we don't reflect how much we're earning in that scheme as well. So I can tell you that between 2020 and 2024, 2025, I didn't get a 25% raise. I was working a lot more, but I wasn't earning 25% more,
Oh, yeah.
Most companies, I think the average raise in the United States is 3.1%
3% per year, yeah.
Right. And
which is less than inflation. So
Right,
I think
right.
statistically speaking, like over the last 10 years, it might even be 20, like that proportionate to inflation, salaries have actually decreased, not increased.
Oh, yeah, 100%. And what you have to realize about the CPI, the official inflation numbers, is that they're very cherry picked. So they do everything they can to make them look better than they actually are. So I talk about this in the book. For example, let's say that they were measuring the price of ground beef, and ground beef gets too expensive, right? Ground beef at the time of this recording, the average price of ground beef is now higher than the minimum wage, right? So if you're making minimum wage, you can't even afford to buy 1 pound of ground beef
for every hour you work.
Right. Back in 2020, I used to buy local ground beef for like $2.50 a pound.
Jeez,
and
that's
so
crazy.
But what you have to realize is that with the CPI, if the price of ground beef gets too high, they're going to notice that people stop buying it because they can't afford it. And so instead, they start buying pork or ground sausage or whatever they buy, and they say, "Oh, well, the consumer has shifted. They're just they substitute it, right? They're substituting ground beef for ground pork. So instead of measuring the price of burger, we're just going to switch and we're going to measure the price of pork." And so the fact that burger has gone up exponentially in the last 5 years doesn't matter for the CPI number because it's been replaced by something cheaper.
Yeah.
And so the government will keep on using these cheaper, price points to make it look a lot lower. And so whenever this cherry pick number is exceeding 3%, which is basically where we're at today, it's horrifying because the real inflation, the true inflation, as I talk about in my book, is probably closer to 7% or 8% each year, depending on what you measure it against. But I think in the book I measure it with like ground beef and the price of eggs and a couple other metrics, college tuition, stuff like that, the average price of a home. And yeah, you find it's on average, it typically ends up being closer to 7% each year. And so really what you need to realize as a young person or whoever's listening to this, if you're not making 7% more each year, you're probably in real terms getting poorer each year, and it's getting harder and harder to get ahead. But most people are programmed to think that every year they get a raise, that's going to make life a little easier. And so they just keep waiting for that raise. But when they get the raise, they realize that every other price in their life has already gone up more than their raise. And so they end up in this endless cycle of trying to get ahead, basically. And so the real reason why, the American dream has essentially died is because once upon a time, like inflation was significantly lower than it is today. Like
Mm.
when the our currency used to be backed by gold, which meant that you'd be able to exchange dollars for gold at a fixed price, and that price didn't really change for a long time. Which basically meant that if you got a 2% raise every year, you're actually making 2% more real money, because the price of everything was kind of stable. And so it was so much easier for a family back then because, you go work and you get a raise every single year and you won't have to worry about trying to outpace the rising cost of everything that you're buying. But, if you look at Johnstown, like I said earlier, in Johnstown, there was around 12,000 steel workers at the time,
Mm.
55 ish years ago. The union starting wage for the steel worker was $6.50 an hour, adjusted for CPI, official government CPI inflation. Today, that's over $40 an hour. So you had 12,000 people in a small city making over $40 an hour with union benefits. We talked about healthcare. There was no copay. Copay used to not be a thing in America. Like you go to the doctor, you didn't pay a penny because
Yeah.
everybody's healthcare was great because people were actually healthy. So,
Mm.
you didn't have to spend an arm and a leg. Meanwhile, today, like, I think the average cost that if you want to have a kid, like just the delivery cost for most hospitals is about 30 grand. And so even if you have insurance, chances are you're going to be paying $6,000 to $8,000 out of pocket just to deliver a baby. And so think about that. If you're a young couple living paycheck to paycheck, you find out that you're pregnant, you have basically 9 months to stash, in many people's cases, $6, $8, $10,000 aside just to cover the cost of delivering the baby. That's not including the additional cost of whatever else you're going to have, all the supplies for a baby, the fact that the wife is going to be off of work because we don't subsidize that time. They can go on what is it, unemployment,
Mm.
and they can earn whatever it is, 40% of their salary or whatever. Which apparently in the state of Florida, like it's only I just learned this out, which I think is funny. Like Florida, your unemployment benefits top out at like the equivalent of $5 an hour. It's kind of fascinating.
That's rough.
That's why a lot of people who left, there's actually a lot of people left California for Florida, and they're starting to actually migrate back because they're learning that like the state embraced a lot of good things, but they failed to actually embrace things that help like the middle class and the lower middle class. And so they're kind of like realizing that like, oh, this is kind of like a dud. I talked to a local real estate investor. He's, flipped over 1,000 houses. He's very good at what he does, but he actually moved here from Florida. And he basically said that like Florida is going to become a wasteland, partially
Mm.
because of those issues, because their salaries, their wages are very low. They're like 37th in the country. They have the second lowest paid teachers in the whole country as well. But the rich are moving there like crazy, and so they have all this excess money, but they're not able to basically build a strong middle class. And so, if you're not able to do that on the community level, I think it's going to tell a horrifying story that like rich people don't fix the problems, but fix it is a strong community, basically a strong middle class. And in America, the middle class is basically it's dissolving, it's becoming extinct, and so we're going to have these two pillars of society. You're going to have the rich and the poor. And what's fascinating is if you look at the spending in America today, the top 10% of the country, the wealthiest 10%, account for over 50% of all spending, right? So they're spending over half of the money that exchanges hands, right?
Mm.
So you have the bottom 90% combined spending 50% of the money. And then you want to talk about how the wealth inequality, which is another section of the book. The top 10% own around 90% of all equities, which is basically stocks, right? Which is basically companies. And so the richest 10% own, call it 90% of the companies, corporations, so to speak. And so what happens when the stock market goes up? Does the average person really get richer? The answer is not really. Most of the, everybody brags about the S&P, the NASDAQ at all-time highs, but who's that really benefiting? It's benefiting the rich, and it shows because they're spending money. But if you talk to somebody in the middle class, they're like, trying to figure out how to pay their bills. We're starting to see foreclosures, start to pop up. And a lot of people are losing their jobs due to AI. And so you have this really nasty cyclone of events happening right now where we have this massive wealth gap, and it's going to get larger because a lot of the positions that AI is eliminating are actually pretty well paid jobs because it's all knowledge based. And so these knowledge based workers who might be upper middle class, they lose their job. They can't find a new job because everybody's in the same boat. And so, what happens is you have a large gap of people who used to support small and local businesses. They're all of a sudden unemployed. So
Mm.
the whole effect trickles down the economy, and the direction that we're heading, like you kind of have to decide, even as a Christian, like, okay, am I going to be in the rich class or the poor class? Because that's what it's coming down to, right? If you don't break into the upper class, it's going to be so much harder to do in 5 to 10 years. Like it's probably going to be harder than ever before. Well, I shouldn't say ever before. It's going to be hard like it was before when people were basically like making poverty wages. That all changed. I talked about that in the book. Henry Ford was the one who actually birthed the middle class. And the story of that is fascinating. Most people don't realize it. They just know that he created the automobile. But
Yeah.
he fought corporate greed, corporate cartels, to the point where he literally had to go and basically buy back his company from his shareholders because he wanted to invest in his employees.
Yeah.
And so what was the effect of that, right? If we look at, what built the middle class, like that's one of the most important stories in American history. And I think a lot of people, would hate the story. Like a lot of, I talk negative about conservatives a lot more than I used to, because I used to be a hardcore conservative. But what I've realized is that you really need a balance of both sides, right? You need
Mm.
conservatism, but you also need what you might call socialism, which is basically like caring for the lower middle class, right?
Mm.
And so I'm no socialist by any means, but I'm also not a hardcore capitalist anymore. And if you look at some of the societies that are the most successful today, you can study places like Singapore, which is a modern day miracle because they basically went from poverty to riches. You study how they do that. They use both sides, right? They weren't radically conservative or radically socialists.
Yeah.
Same thing with El Salvador. When the current leader got elected president, conservatives were like, this guy's horrible. Like he's basically a fake conservative, yada, yada, yada.
Mm.
Then he became like the most successful leader in the world, has the highest approval rating. Now all of a sudden they're like, oh, he's one of the most conservative people alive. But it's just comical because it's not true. He has these very conservative principles which work really well, but he also has very like democratic principles that work really well,
Mm.
such as having a government funded basically a government funded market, right? So farmers basically can set up shop for free at these markets, and they can sell their produce direct to the citizens. And so what's the result of that? You cut out the middleman. What happens when the middleman gets cut out? Like the average person saves a ton of money on groceries. Farmers become wealthy again, and like
Mm.
everybody's happy except for the middleman, which basically I would argue is not needed.
Yeah.
And so the example, but the point I'm trying to make is that, you know, I think everybody needs to apply this logic, but especially the church. Like, if we're going to be, radically conservative or radically Democrats, I should say. I think once we realize that there's very strong and needed arguments on both sides,
Mm.
if you look at what's happening in the world, you can kind of see like what happens when we swing too far left or too far right, right?
Yeah.
And Florida is one of the developing places that swung, in my opinion, too far right. That like, the governor was bragging about like, oh, our GDP increased 88% basically since I became governor, which is really a huge feat. That's incredible. But you realize that they have the second lowest paid teachers in the state. Like that's embarrassing. Like I wouldn't want to have my kids in those schools because the schools are horrible from what
Mm.
I've heard, from what teachers have said. Like they're understaffed, they need more help. And so the state has more than enough money that they could have the best paid teachers in the entire country. And if you did that, I think there'd be, I think the effects would be great.
Yeah.
Not that pays everything, but it makes a big difference. But, it's kind of just returning this principle like, okay, if we're going to be ultra capitalists, we're going to make all this money. Like, if we don't basically help the lower middle class, like redistribute it in some ways, like, what's the point?
Yep.
Because when the wealth of the rich like snowballs and people start to notice it, like, they're going to turn the pendulum always swings, right? And so if it swung really hard right, it's actually going to probably swing really hard left, because they were sold this idea that, hey, if we cut all these taxes and these rich people move here, then our life's going to get better. But what we're seeing in Florida is that the life of the average Floridian person really hasn't improved at all. It's actually kind of the same. And so they're not going to be happy. And so, what happens, maybe there's a Democrat next time, which most people will not acknowledge. I actually, to fully disclose, I made a betting prediction that there's this candidate named James Fishback. He's at like a 10% chance right now, so you can 10x your money. But I bet that he's going to win governor, because if you look at his rallies, like he's packing these venues and they're turning away people because he's so popular. But he's actually a Republican, but he's literally running on these principles that, like, I don't want to support these corporations. I want to support the working class. Like, basically, like, we need to tell data centers they can't build here. We need to support our farmers. We need to reinvest in these orange groves. And
Mm.
that's the kind of stuff that's starting to resonate with people, because they're realizing that, this massive like tax breaks and conservatism on full extreme isn't actually working well either. It's working for the rich and the upper class, but it's
Yeah.
not working for most people. And so all that to say is, like, as a Christian, where does our political view go? I believe it needs to be like very much close to the center, because I don't believe in socialism. I don't believe in communism, but I also think that if we're going to be full blown like capitalists, we end up in a scenario like today where the wealthiest people are paying lower tax rates than the working class. Like, I think that's very wrong, but a lot
Mm.
of people will stand up for the wealthy. I have an interesting chart in this book. There's two different charts. It has the average, basically middle class person in America, and then it has the chart of Jeff Bezos, and it basically has their net worth, and it shows the difference that they pay in taxes, and it shows their net worth. And so,
Mm.
if you look at the average middle class person, their net worth is actually on the bottom line. It's going like this, and then their average taxes is like right above it. So it kind of like trends up like this. I'll probably just put the chart over top of my face in the short if I make a short. But you have these two charts. So the average working class person, their net worth basically scales, right? So what they're paying in taxes, their net worth is increasing, right? Then you have somebody like Jeff Bezos, not to pick on Jeff, but it's just an easy example.
He can handle it.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and this is before he became. I mean, his net worth at the time was only like 22 billion, so it was
Only.
about a tenth of what it is today.
Yes, only.
But you look at his, if you look at his tax rate, like, there's a tiny line on the bottom of the taxes he paid that's basically flat with the bottom of the line. Then there's his net worth that kind of just goes like this, right? And so during the time frame, I believe he made like over $100 billion in net worth, but his total taxes paid was like 1.3 billion. And so effectively, his tax rate to his net worth was like a couple percent maybe. Whereas the average working person, like, they actually paid more in taxes than they gained in net worth, right? And so why is there such a huge divide there? It's because our whole tax system is literally rigged in favor of people who are wealthy and are smart enough to understand that, they can basically get away with paying zero taxes, even though they're billionaires, even though they're super rich, right? And so, whenever we swing hard to the right, hard towards conservatism, these conservatives, like, they talk a big talk, but a lot of times what they'll do is they'll put these like tax incentives and advantages in the tax bill so that basically the wealthiest people can avoid paying taxes. And, the working class might get a little bit of relief, but compared to what the wealthy and the rich get, it's very minimal, right?
Mm.
And so, all that to say, as Christians, I think we need to reevaluate how we think about taxes as well. Because a lot of people think that there shouldn't be any taxes, but I think in scripture, I think really the only time we hear taxes is when Jesus is like, yeah, pay your taxes. That's basically what it is. And, Jesus, he wasn't telling them like find loopholes on how you can pay the lowest taxes, or he didn't say any of that. He's just like, yeah, pay your taxes and, basically fund the kingdom of God. Right. So, I think we got to be really, really catchy on that, because what I've learned in my personal life is that, like I said, there's both sides are necessary, right? And so if you want to go to a country that has 0% taxes, go check it out, see how well they run and how safe you feel and how good it is. And if you like that enough, then move there, right? But, a lot of people, a lot of people live in California, right? Why do you think a lot of people live in California with a super high tax rate?
I don't know, because it's sunny out there.
Yeah, maybe, right? They love the quality of life. They love the communities out there. They love, they basically love living there, right? And so they're paying high taxes. They enjoy it enough that they're not leaving. I mean, a lot of people do leave, but like I said, people are going back. And so at the end of the day, like if you're only focused on money, right, you probably have some greed in your heart. And so I'm a fan of, like I'm happy that I live in a state that has a state tax. A lot of places don't, like Florida, Texas, they don't have income tax right? So Pennsylvania has like a 3% income tax. And, I look around at the state of Pennsylvania, I think we're doing very well. And I think that like we have very well paid teachers, or people that work on the turnpike are paid pretty well. People that work for the prison are paid pretty well. We have a system where every single kid's guaranteed to some degree subsidized healthcare. It's not entirely free, but it could be free, or it could be a couple $100 a month. And so you look at those benefits and you start weighing them, and it's like, okay, like I can move to a state like Florida that doesn't have as many benefits, and maybe I'm rich, and if I go there, I'm keeping more of my money. But to the people who aren't rich, they're gonna have a harder time getting ahead in life, right? Because once you have kids, you realize that all of a sudden healthcare is obnoxiously expensive. So it's nice to live in a state where even if you're making a lot of money, I forget what the rate is. Like, I think the cap's around $200 a month you pay for your kid to have really good health insurance in Pennsylvania if you don't have a job that's covered with the employer. So
That's interesting.
yeah, it's an interesting perspective. It's an interesting way to look at it, right? And so like if your wife's a teacher, which she's not, but let's just pretend she was, like if you're looking to move to Florida and your wife's looking at the schools and she's like, oh my gosh, I'm not going to teach there. Like that's, the pay is garbage and the environment's garbage. I don't want to go there. Right. So your wife's not a teacher, so you don't care about that. But if she was, all of a sudden you have more of an emphasis to like care more about that. 'Cause I think schools are important. I think having good schools are important. A lot of people care about that when they move to a house. They're looking at the schools, how they're rated and stuff. So
Sure.
and I'm probably going to homeschool my kids, but I still want a good public school because most people aren't fortunate enough to be able to afford to homeschool or private school. So their kids go to public school. And so if your public schools are garbage, that's not good for your community. I think we should want the best schools for our community.
It's another argument for financial freedom and reinvesting in the community.
Right, absolutely.
Essentially.
So, yeah, that was a bit of a rabbit hole, but
well, yeah, I think it's
interesting.
I think it's a good point. So we're not talking about like the systematic redistribution of wealth as in communism or socialism.
Right.
We're talking more about like free markets as opposed to capitalism. I think the free market part of capitalism is the important part. Like everybody gets to decide their own worth and value and come to an agreement in salary. And that is the system that has almost broken down as far as like the death of the American dream goes. Like no longer is there like really an agreement between you and your employer to make sure that you paid what you think you're worth, because there's like, we've set the worth of the middle class so low. There's so much competition. Like my field is technology. People are flowing in from overseas who are willing to take lower salaries for technology jobs who can do them just as well. And so we're seeing that the salary just comes down. You have to take what you can get. And so that system is kind of broken down. So I guess I would just say that the problem is the system. Like in theory, the combination of those things would work. Like ideally you would have a free market where wealth and GDP are up. Like money is being earned and produced, and then ideally those people put those things back into their businesses rather than our government just like hoarding it or spending it on war or whatever ridiculous things that they're spending it on. So the problem is the democracy in the United States largely. It's like if you put somebody in charge of redistributing it, I think you would have the same problem. The problem is the corruption of our democracy, where there's nobody who feels like their vote is going to make a difference on the economy at large. Like you have no say over where the federal government is spending their money, even though you vote for such and such a candidate to go into the House of Representatives and they do nothing for you there and nothing changes and you're still making the same amount of money and like all of that. So that's what I'm thinking about that. Like, so all of these are ideals that we're talking about, like what an ideal maybe governmental system would look like. And personally, I'm a small government guy, so I have, slightly differing views from what you do, but the end goal is the same. Like, let's make sure that communities are being focused on and that people who earn the money get to like choose via their vote or whatever it is where the money
Mhm.
goes, rather than the people at the top of society getting to choose where the money goes and where the tax breaks come
Mm.
from and all that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, it does, yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's why it's interesting. There's so many different studies, not really studies, but like real life examples in the world where you can kind of study what works and what hasn't worked. And
Mm.
so, like, Singapore is a radical example because it kind of breaks a lot of people's ideas of what would be successful, right? Even to the point of like, you could argue that like the leader of Singapore, the prime minister, is basically a king, but the nation prospered so much because he was such a good leader
Mm.
and his ideas were just genius. And so that's kind of more of a sidetrack that I probably don't want to go into today. But
Yeah.
I think for most people though, it's worth studying. Like read the book that he wrote called "From Third World to First." It's a 700-page book, so it'll take you a couple years. But you start reading, like for example, he banned chewing gum in the country. Like you still can't go to Singapore and chew gum. It's illegal, but like you think like why would you do that? It's because like, how many places do you see people spit gum? It's kind of nasty. It turns you off, right? And so you go to these
Just get
places
rid of
and
it.
there's like they're just like hardcore and like we need to be clean, we need to have greenery, like these kind of things that you don't think about, but like they make a giant impact
Mm.
on society. And so
That's interesting.
yeah. But to get back to kind of your point, um, I think when you want to talk about politics, I think what the church needs to understand is that I agree that governments for the most part are garbage. Like
Yeah.
there's very few people who are genuine in government.
Both sides of the
So
aisle are broken.
yeah, they're very much like you shouldn't put your faith and your hope in them. But what we should
Mm.
realize is that as the Christian community, like it's actually our job, I think, to play that role of government. And so what that looks like is, starting the business. Like, if you can get to a place where you're like basically wealthy, where you might have influence or whatever you want to
Influential,
call it.
yeah.
Yeah. You have the choice to basically pay your employees living wages, good wages, pay them more than they deserve. You have the ability to
Mm.
fund whatever you think is necessary in the community. You can fund projects, you can invest in playgrounds, you can do whatever you want with it, right? And so now you don't need the government to do that because you're the one who's doing it. You're taking care of the people that you love. You're taking care of your community. And so that's kind of like this added benefit. So as corporations start to care less and less about the employee, we have to realize that if we don't step up, it's going to become almost too far gone to the point where like you're not going to have a choice. You have to work for this giant company
Yep.
or else like, because at that point it might, we don't know what it's going to look like to start up a business in 10 years,
Yep.
but the corporate playbook for the longest time has been to crush, small and local businesses, right? If you study Walmart, they have this thing called the Walmart effect, which basically says that when Walmart puts up a store in your community, what happens is the local businesses basically shut down because Walmart competes with them. They underprice them. And so the local
Yeah.
businesses shut down because everybody, once again, if you're in the community and you're cheap and you can get tires for cheaper at Walmart, you're going to get them at Walmart
Yep.
because you don't care about your community. And so that echoes throughout. People lose their jobs, businesses shut down, and what the actual economic effect is that the average, the median wage, the average wage drops sometimes significantly in every single one of these communities. That's what's happened.
Mm.
Um, but on the flip side of that, you have the Costco effect, which is very strange because Costco actually deliberately overpays their staff. Like they make a lot more money than people who work at Walmart. And what they've actually realized is that, since Costco is more wholesale, they sell more like stuff that's more catered to maybe small businesses. It actually does the exact opposite effect. So you put a Costco in a community, it actually raises the average wage over time because, they're not necessarily competing as much as Walmart might be with all these other industries. And they're paying their people
Better.
significantly better. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it leaves a big effect. It makes a big effect, and that's something that I try to think of too. Like, what good does Walmart do in the community or what good does any, these corporates do in the community? A lot of times there's no incentives, there's no bonuses. It doesn't matter if you do good or bad. Like you're
Mm.
paid an hourly wage. It doesn't matter if your store kicks butt or not.
Yeah.
I was at Lowe's a week or two ago, and I don't think Lowe's has raised their wage since COVID. Like I think they're still making about 14 an hour.
Mm.
I don't know for sure because every time you go to the store, they're always advertising that they're hiring, but they take a marker and they black out the starting wage because I think it must be so bad that they figure if people see it,
Jeez.
they won't waste their time applying. But long story short, like their turnover is going through the roof. There was this one guy who we always work with who was like, pretty high up, but he's leaving. He's been there like 26 years. And so, it's kind of like, I just can't stand this anymore. Like it's so corporatized.
Yep.
And once again, we go back to the original idea. Like if people like go work for a corporation, like if you never have, just like go work for one and see how it is. Go work for Lowe's, go work for Walmart, go work for whatever. And like people make the argument like, oh, you can just, just go work really hard, work your way up the corporate ladder. Like those days are gone. I don't think people realize it. Like you
Yep.
can be the absolute best person in the company and your odds of being able to climb the ladder are like close to zero, I think,
Yep.
because there's so much downward pressure on wages. There's so much offshoring. There's so much H-1B visa applications, which I cover extensively in my book as well. And so there's so much downward pressure on wages that to climb the corporate ladder, to do good, to get raises and promotions are very difficult today in America. It's not about working hard. Like, some of the people I see working the hardest are like, they don't get anywhere. Like they're stuck at the bottom
Yep.
for so long and they try so hard and they just can't get anywhere.
Yep.
And, if your company doesn't value you, then you end up getting depressed. Like it's very hard. I don't think people realize how difficult it is to work in a job, in a position, in an environment where you're not valued, where people don't appreciate you.
Yep.
I've never really been in that scenario because I'm very grateful that pretty much all my jobs, like I've been valued and taken fairly well care of. But I know that there's certainly a lot of people in a lot of places that that's not the case, And I wouldn't
100%.
work for them. I wouldn't work for a place like that.
Yep. Yeah, that's tough.
It
I was thinking
is.
a recent example of this is Buc-ee's. Have you seen Buc-ee's? Like
Oh
in the
yeah,
South?
yeah.
They're notoriously like they're opening like crazy and they're super successful. And half of that is because they like pay their people crazy well.
Oh
Like
yeah,
a
it's great.
starting like floor manager, shift manager in there is making like 28, 29 bucks an hour at a gas
Yeah.
station.
Yeah,
They
it's
paying their
great.
people super well and they love working there.
Yeah. It kind of just goes to show like a lot of conservatives will argue that like we shouldn't, like basically that people shouldn't get paid more is what it boils down to. Like
Mm-hmm.
companies don't have the money to pay their employees more. But
It's not true.
what we're seeing today is that there's starting to become these giant wage gaps, right? So you said like Buc-ee's, like, you could go work at Buc-ee's and make more money than you make being an assembly line worker or working for a variety of
They make
jobs.
just less than me in a like I have 5 years of experience in technology.
Right, yeah,
Just a little less
a
than me.
bachelor's or a master's degree now, right? You have a
I do have a
master's
master's
degree?
degree. It's
Yeah,
not
so
technology though, but yeah.
yeah, but same thing. So, I actually did a little bit of research on this recently because Walmart did a ginormous share buyback. And
Mm,
so a share buyback, for those of you who don't know, is basically when the company goes out and they buy stocks or shares of their company back off the market. And the reason why they do this is whenever, basically by doing this, they increase the price of their stock. And the reason why this is important is when a company does a share buyback, they have excess money because they made so much money that they don't know what to do with it. So they buy back their own shares. By buying back their own shares, the value of their stock goes up. And the executives at this company, most of them are paid in shares of the company. And so what this eventually resolves to is that share buybacks are basically at all-time highs. They're continuing to climb. Companies have so much money that they're doing this, and they're basically making the executives way more richer and richer and richer. And I just did like a basic AI. I asked AI, I was like, hey, the amount of money that Walmart just did the stock buyback for, if they would have distributed it to every single employee in their company,
mm.
how much would it come down to? And the amount of money that Walmart spent doing stock buybacks recently, if they would have gave that money to each of their employees as a bonus, would have amounted to, I believe it was $13,000 per employee. And that's for 1 quarter, right? So you take that times 4, that means the equivalent of what Walmart is doing stock buybacks for would amount to $52,000 per employee. And that would be on top of what they're already paying their employees. So if you want to do a case study, how much could Walmart theoretically pay their employees They could raise their starting wage to $20, $25 an hour, and they'd still be making quite a bit of profit. And so Walmart is still paying their employees $14 an hour in many cases. They've been paying them that for years. They're not raising the wage, and a lot of conservatives will be like, "Oh, well, they don't have the money to do that." But the reality is that they have more than enough money to do that. These companies have more than enough money to pay their workers well. The problem is, once again, as we move more towards these giant corporations, they do not care about employees and wages, and they're going to do everything they can to hoard money, right? There's a giant lawsuit, or not a lawsuit, but there's a giant movement going around regarding Starbucks, right? I think I talk about this in the book as well, but Starbucks, they have stores that are going unionized, and a lot of people obviously think that's insane, that's crazy. They're baristas, yada yada yada. But
Mm.
Starbucks has spent hundreds of millions of dollars basically to try to break up these unions. They call it union busting. So instead of paying their employees more, they pay to try and break
Break
up
the
this
unions. Yeah.
idea of unionizing so that they can get better taken care of. But when you start looking at the CEO to employee pay ratio in America, that's where it gets pretty interesting because 50 or so years ago, like the average CEO only made like between 20 and 30 times what the average worker made, right?
Just
So
still significant, but
yeah, right. It's a pretty significant gap, but today that average has risen to over 300 times. And so
that's wild.
for Starbucks, like it's an ironic number. It's kind of funny, but like they were having the protest. Like the Starbucks CEO, he got paid basically $100 million for 3 months of work. Their new CEO, they gave him a private jet. He flies around everywhere. Like they're paying him like an arm and a leg. And then people are wondering why the baristas are wanting to unionize because they're not making very much money.
Mm.
But when you do the math and you add up like the CEO to worker pay for the average Starbucks worker, the CEO makes like 6,666 times more than the average barista, which is, I mean, it's an interesting number,
Oh
but
yeah,
it's
that's an
a
interesting
bizarrely
number.
huge number, right? And a lot of these companies, the CEO to worker pay is outrageous. And when you sit back and you really think about like, how much money is $100 million? Like, a lot of people would be like, oh well, it's their money, they deserve it. But like at the end of the day, like 100 million is more than either of us could conceive.
Yep.
Like for 3 months of work, that's more than we can conceive. And so maybe that's not a big deal if you're paying your employees all more than they deserve. You're paying them really good wages. Because if you would just do that simple thing, like your employees would be pretty happy, right? You wouldn't have high turnover. You wouldn't have to deal with union busting. But the corporations today, the companies, they would rather spend money trying to basically underpay their employees so that they can put more in their own pockets than actually, pay them fair, pay them well.
Yep.
And that's a giant pivot from what we saw, like I said, 50 something years ago, where, profits were more shared among employees, right? And it's not like a full form of socialism, but the concept of like, hey, we had a really good year. Here's an extra bonus. Like that's pretty much unheard of. But that used to
Mm.
be the normal, even in areas like where we grew up and we live in. Like some of the smaller companies that are now owned by corporations, like they used to like literally take their profits and be like, oh, hey, we had a great year. Here's a giant bonus, or here's some extra pay, or here's this and that. But
Yeah.
like, today it's kind of like, ah, well, I was working for a company. I think they beat their goal by like 30%. So you're talking like tens of millions of dollars in extra profits. And like I don't think we really got any like additional bonus. Like I think I got a 0.75% additional raise, maybe, which amounted to
Oh
like
yeah. a
8 or
hundred
7
bucks.
7 or 8 cents or something like that. But
Yeah.
like the amount of money was obnoxious. But like all you have to do is be like, hey, here's an extra $1,000 or $2,000 Christmas bonus. We had a blowout year. Like congratulations. But maybe we got like $100 gift card or something. So
Yeah.
it just goes back to like what are we, if you're working at a corporation, you need to ask yourself, like, what am I supporting? What are the fruits of my labor, right? Because your paycheck is probably significantly less than what you're producing for these companies, right? If you work really hard at your company, maybe you go out and you sell a bunch of products. Like, if you work at a company where it's like if you sell, $10,000 or $100,000, you make the same amount of money. Like, you need to really evaluate, like, should I really be working at a place where if I'm working really hard, there's no benefit to my community?
Mm.
And I think that's something that if we sit back and analyze, like, I'd rather work at a small company making less money, but knowing that if I do a good job, like, I'm basically benefiting my community. I'm blessing it
Yep.
because the people who own it have similar views as me, right?
Yep.
And so if we start emphasizing that, we'll see a giant change in our communities. And so if you want to revive small towns, small cities, like that's what you do. And I think like, even Pittsburgh, if you go to Pittsburgh, like you're starting to see, big changes in Pittsburgh because they kind of have more of that emphasis on like the small local shops and they're very popular for that. It's becoming a coffee town, which is really cool. And, I think people just don't realize how vital that is. I think that's like the number one thing that the Christian community needs to realize. Like, if you care about the next generation, if you care about the American dream for young people, like, we need to go back to the drawing board and be like, okay, how do we basically encourage people to start businesses, to chase down their passions and dreams
Mm.
on every single level? Because even if you're a carpenter, like, you can go work for a big company or you can start your own company and you
Mm.
make a lot more starting your own company. You'd probably be able to charge your neighbors less money because there's no middleman overhead, all that stuff, right?
Sure.
So everybody benefits from it, right?
Yep.
So, yeah.
That's so good. Let's talk practical for a second. So
hmm
with all of that said, like with it established, what like we're talking about starting businesses, we're talking about investments. What can the average person do? The person who's making 40, 50, 60 grand a year, working as a wage slave, they're doing okay, but their money doesn't go anywhere. They're hardly saving. They don't have, like maybe if they're lucky, they'll be able to retire at 65 and like live reasonably comfortably with the retirement pension that they have.
hmm
Like, what can we do to step out? So we talked about starting businesses, but I mentioned that like not everybody's an entrepreneur, I think. So it can be kind of hard. Like carpenter is a good example, like maybe they can set that up. But even like my skill set, it's sort of hard to be practical. Like I know technology, but the risk associated with, do I turn that into a business? Do I self-employ? Do I try to get marketing, reach out to people and see if I can do, you know, data and technology work for them? That can be difficult and really intimidating, especially for people who struggle with creativity and stuff like that. So like starting businesses, investing in unorthodox investments, because if you put into the S&P 500, like if you put $500 a month in there, whatever you can manage to put in there, like you're going to make a return on it, but it's going to be about 1% higher than inflation if you're lucky, maybe 2. I think that's
hmm
right. I think the S&P 500, when it's doing really well, you might make like a 10% return over 5-10 years, as opposed to inflation's about 5-6.
Yeah, with
um
inflation, yeah.
yeah, so what do you think about that? So what are investment options? What would you say to people who are having a hard time starting a business? Like even me, I have a hard time being creative, like thinking of like
Mm,
I am creative, but like thinking of ideas to like start a business and then put money into that, being able to like
mhm,
launch that, like leave your 9 to 5 job and launch that is kind of intimidating. So I'm
yeah.
curious what you think about that. And maybe you could mention a little bit about how you made your money through investments as well, as you're comfortable. Like I'm just
Mhm.
curious what you think about those things practically.
Yeah, great question. So I think for most people who are living paycheck to paycheck, I think the most important thing that you can probably do is figure out how to start investing on a regular basis.
Mm,
Now, it's recommended to do at least 10%. Most people probably can't do 10%. I understand that. But,
yeah.
you got to start somewhere. And so, step number one should be to look at where you're spending your money and figure out where you can cut back, right?
Mm,
If you already cut back as much as you're comfortable doing so, you're probably going to have to start working a side hustle, right? Which, by the way, I mentioned it in the book. A majority of Gen Z has at least one side hustle. Some are working multiple jobs, but I think it's close to 70%, 70%. So if you want to tell me that, the young people are just lazy and entitled, like, I'm going to tell you that stat, like they're out there hustling. Most of them have to work more than their 9 to 5 job to cover their expenses, right? It's really tough out there.
yep.
So the stats don't really lie. So figure out how you can save, I like try to get to 10%. And I would recommend not putting it in retirement. A lot of people put money in retirement, which isn't necessarily bad. But the problem that most people don't think about when you put money in a 401k is that that money gets locked away until you're of age to retire, which is like what, around 60. I don't know. I don't know exactly. It might be 55. But
60 if you're lucky, 65 is I think typical.
yeah. So, I mean, you could have $1 million in your 401k, but if you're not of age, it doesn't matter. Like you can't tap into it. So
Yep.
I recommend, and by the way, I think it's worthwhile to understand how taxes work because most people, if you're living paycheck to paycheck, if you're not making that much money, your effective tax rate might already be like 0%. So there's not much benefit to having a retirement. But all that aside, figure out how you can start investing on a regular basis. Pretty much all wealthy people start somewhere, right? And the difference between investing 0% and 5% over the course of a decade or two is significant. Um, so I think that's the most important thing. And you don't even have to have like the best investment ideas. Like if you put your money in the S&P 500, I think that's a good start. That's better than most.
Yep.
I'm a very, what you might call a risky investor. I invest in a lot of different places. I do fairly well, I think, doing that. But, I think for most young people, though, the way I got started and what helped me the most was being able to buy my first house, my first piece of real estate. There's a lot of programs out there for first time buyers. You get lower rates. Sometimes you get special financing. I got special extra assistance for down payment stuff. So I only really needed like $2,000 down to buy my first house, which is crazy. But if you can afford to buy a house, I think that, I would encourage you to go out, find a good deal, basically find a piece of property that isn't the most aesthetically pleasing, but that you can basically put some new paint on the wall and maybe do a couple modifications to make it look a lot nicer than what it is. Those are probably your best deals. Find a deal like that, purchase it, and whenever you get time, kind of just work on it, make it look nicer. What I was able to do was purchase a house. I put some money into it. I had some remodeling skills, and
You bought your house pre-COVID, right?
right, yeah,
Which is a heck of a time to get in.
oh yeah, it was great. I think between when I bought, it only took me 2 years from when I bought, which my house was very cheap. I'm not going to say how much, but basically, what it appraised at 2 years later after putting I think it was less than 15 grand. It was probably around $15,000. So I put $15,000 into it. It reappraised for about $100,000 more, and I paid for it 2 years later. So in 2 years, because I found a good deal, I found an opportunity that other people overlooked. I basically on paper made $100,000 and I only had to put down 2,000. So that's like a 50x return.
Yeah.
And my mortgage was very cheap. Like I would have been paying rent otherwise. So it wasn't like I was really paying any extra for that. So I think that, if you really want to build wealth, you have to understand the concept of value add. And so what this looks like on the most basic fundamental level, a lot of people like to go to thrift stores or discount stores, TJ Maxx. They like to find good deals, right? I think a lot of people are actually really good at that. And so if you want to be an investor, you need to apply that to real life. So a lot of people will go out and they'll buy clothing at 80% off and they'll be like, oh, I found this great deal. Look how amazing it is. But if they would apply that to buying investments or assets, they actually probably become very wealthy. So go out and find a piece of property or a house that's underpriced that people are overlooking for whatever reason. It might be an easy fix. It could be cosmetically unappealing, but you can make a lot of money by easily remodeling real estate. You don't even need to really do the work yourself. Like everybody can paint, everybody can, do new things. And sometimes, you might need to replace some countertops, paint some cabinets, do stuff like that. Makes a significant difference. And so that's what I recommend most people do to get started. But once you're able to, like I said, put aside 5 to 10% of your income, and if you have to go DoorDash, go DoorDash. Like you have to do something because if you're not able to put anything in investments, like it's only going to get harder, right? Yep. It's not going to be next year you're going to have more money. Like inflation's it's going to outrun you. And so if you don't start today, you're probably never going to start. So figure out how to put money aside every single month. And like I said, 10% is what your goal should be. If you get to 10%, keep on going up. I think at my peak, I was doing 25% of my paycheck, and I put that directly into Bitcoin, which Bitcoin is probably around 30,000 for most of that. So,
did you hold it?
Oh yeah, I didn't sell.
Good stuff.
Most of that. So that is, that's at that point, like, I was very fortunate, and I'm very blessed, and the Lord gave me a lot of wisdom and insight, but. For me, cryptocurrency was a large factor in generating wealth, and I think that the returns in crypto, they have been magnificent, and I think they'll continue to be. Now, I'm not a financial advisor, so I can't give you financial advice, but
We'll throw it up at the beginning.
I will say that, I have a lot of Bitcoin. My portfolio is heavily in Bitcoin, and when you buy Bitcoin for 20,000 ish and it appreciates to, at its high 120, that's a 600% return in a handful of years.
Did you sell some at 120?
I did, yeah.
DCA
The Lord revealed that I should sell, and that's how we partially paid for our new house, right? So,
great.
That's another thing too. We just moved, right? So the house that we're selling, like it's basically under contract now. The house that we just bought is about a third the price of what we're selling our old house for, right? Our old house was, I would say, nicer. It had more luxuries. It had air conditioning, which we're missing now.
Yeah.
But, you get to a point where you start to realize that, it comes down to self-denial. So if you're struggling, living paycheck to paycheck, you have to figure out, how can I deny my flesh? How can I deny what I want? If you're going out to eat, if you're buying expensive things, like a lot of people might spend a lot of money on clothing or shoes, like all that stuff can be easily cut out. And that should be your investment. That should be your investments right there. But I feel for the people that literally do live below their means and they're paycheck to paycheck. Those people, you really got to reevaluate what you're doing in life, because that's not a fun place to be. And if you don't do something, it's gonna get harder for you, I believe. And so what I would recommend doing, like I said, go try to DoorDash. I know it's not going to be fun, but I DoorDash on the side. Sometimes I make about $20 an hour, and that's pretty decent money for pretty flexible schedule. But just take all that money and invest it. If you can make an extra 50 or $100 a week working 2 nights DoorDashing, that's the difference between you being poor most of your life and you become building wealth, right?
Have a little extra cash to throw around.
Yeah, that's what it comes down to. So,
yeah.
But I agree, most people probably won't start businesses, but I think that every one of us should, at some degree, be an investor. And whenever we start to build what I call snowball, it's a net worth snowball. As you build that, you'll be able to start purchasing freedom, right? So you won't be tied down to a job. And if it gets to a point where your job starts doing immoral things, or maybe you don't agree with what's happening, you're able to walk away, right? You gain leverage, right? That's what I realized, like, if you don't have leverage, if you're living paycheck to paycheck, like, you're kind of stuck at your job, or else you have to find a new job, but you might be able to find a new job that pays as well. So if that's the case, like, we know a lot of people that work for the prison, and they pretty much all basically say they hate it. And so, our heart goes out to them, and it's a pretty good paying job, but like,
good money and benefits.
If you're not thinking about, like, how do I get out of this? Like, a lot of them, they're probably just putting money aside for retirement, and they get a pension and stuff. But I don't think that way. I think of, how can I exit a 9-to-5, 40-hour a week job as early as possible so that I can go out and do whatever I want to do. And that's kind of where I got to. I got to a point where, our family's finances, at least at the peak of the last crypto cycle, was significant. And I said, I can quit my job and I can go independent. And that's what I did. And, we took a hit with income, and there's been, it's about a year. It's been about a year since I left my full-time job. And, we made a lot less money, but, we're kind of able to pay our bills, and it's starting to climb a bit. And so now we're getting to a point now that our house is finally selling. So we're going to have a bit of money to play with, and so we're brainstorming some ideas. I mean, my wife's planning to start a business here very soon, and we got a lot going on. But the level of freedom that I have, I work basically part-time. Sometimes I work like mostly 40 hours a week, but sometimes I'm working like 10 hours a week because it's just the off week for work. I do carpentry work now, and that's something I realized too. Like, I got a degree in IT. And I don't say this to brag, but I think I'm very gifted with business and IT. And like, I think I'm actually a very valuable person. And I've had my past employers tell me that, like, they basically said I'm very good, but they weren't able to pay me anymore, of course.
Yes, that's my life. I also am good at my job, but not any room for me to grow, a
Right.
salary rise, or
Which is
they're not
very,
going to
which
put me
is
in charge of the department or something.
right. Which kind of goes back to the point of like working up the corporate ladder. But
Yeah.
all that stuff aside, like I pivoted in life to carpentry because I see the future and I think that AI takes a lot of jobs.
Yep.
And if you're working behind a computer, there's a high likelihood that in the next couple of years, your job's going to be replaced by AI chatbot or robot or whatever. And
Mm.
like I used to be like a customer service rep for part of my job. And I never thought that the level of that would be replaceable in the near future. But I recently called somebody who had a small business who had an AI chatbot, and it was strangely really good.
Yep.
It
And
was
they're making big
strangely
money on
really
those
good.
things. It's a big business.
And so I think we're really close to the edge where like all of a sudden AI chatbot's actually going to be better performing than a customer service rep, unless you're like the best customer service reps. But most of the time, they're kind of just like, the job doesn't pay enough for highly skilled people to do it, is what I'm basically saying. So
Yep.
anyway, working carpentry, like I think like, I can make a lot more money once I learn the skills and I'm very good at doing it. I have the tools, where I'm at my old job, getting a 60, actually after taxes, I was getting about a 50-cent raise per year.
Mhm.
And, once you lay that out against your different increases, like we live in a city where I guess the average water bill has increased 7% for the last like decade.
Yeah.
Which I mean, it's not a huge bill, but like it starts to compound. And every other bill, I read that like the gas company wants to increase rates to the average of like, I think it's like 25 a month for the average family. So
Mm.
every single one of those increases, like, if I looked at that, like, okay, well, 50 cents an hour is $4 a day. It's $20 a week. It's $80 a month. So if my expenses weren't rising $80 a month with a growing family, with inflation, with growing prices, like I end up at a place where I'm like, basically, I'm actually getting poor every single year. Not
Yep.
necessarily like net worth poor, but my wages are going less far. And
Yep.
so when you own your own business, you're able to scale a lot more effectively. And,
More control.
the smartest people in the world right now are saying that electricians and plumbers are going to be the next like lawyers and doctors,
Yeah.
which tells you that like every single person that has a job based on what you know in your brain, your knowledge, you're at risk of being replaced by AI. And
Mm.
I think that a lot of those people are going to have a really humbling experience because they spent a lot of money and have a lot of debt and they're probably pretty prideful, but like there's going to come a day when like their firms are just going to lay them off because everything they know, like if AI knows, then
AI
what's the
can know
point?
it. Yeah. That's
Yeah. So like
a good point.
it's going to be a fascinating time. But yeah, for the average person, you got to figure out how to invest every single month. And like I said, I would encourage you to read books, listen to podcasts, like try to be more of a riskier investment, like find stocks that you can buy and stuff. But if you're not into that, like if you just think that's horrible, then not official financial advice. But if I was you, I would just put my money into Bitcoin or the S&P 500 or a combination of both, and just maybe even like NASDAQ or whatever, and just let it sit because it'll compound. And the S&P, if it grows 10-11% each year, I mean, you know it's a return. It's a lot better than a lot of things. So
Mm.
big, but it's a part of life. And so make sure that your goal is to purchase time. You want more family time, you want more time to travel, you want all these things. Like how can you do it? There's a lot of ways, but if
Yeah.
if you're not willing to put anything aside, you're always gonna be poor. You're not gonna be able to just magically make more money. But I think a lot of people think they will,
Yep.
and it's not easy. So
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about podcasts and stuff like that, but like and no one in the room is a financial advisor, just for the 18th time. But how do people identify good investments? So like how do you see, like if you're a little further out on the risk curve, I think everybody knows, like if you go to any financial podcast, they're going to tell you immediately what's not on the risk curve. They're going to tell you to invest in like, you know, 100 company funds, 500 company funds, trackers, gold, stuff that is known to increase over time as long as you hold it. Those are secure investments. If you get an investment advisor, they'll tell you to invest in that stuff. how do people, if they're willing to go a little out on the risk curve, maybe just with part of their portfolio, how do you identify a good investment? How do you identify a good cryptocurrency that you think is maybe going to go up in the future?
Yeah, I think if you have the mindset of it's fun, I think that helps a lot.
Mm,
And if you start investing on a regular basis, you will notice that like your brain activity goes through the roof because you're always looking, you're always observing, you're always thinking and listening. Like, what are people talking about? What are people doing?
mm,
And I'm reading a book about one of the best investors in the world, and his whole thesis is basically like just be observant in life. And so look at your kids, look at what they're doing, look at what they have interests in, right? When I was a
mm.
kid in 5th grade, I was obsessed with Apple. I thought the iPad was the coolest thing. I thought the iPhone was the coolest thing. But my parents probably didn't, adults didn't. But if they would have been observant and saw that like me and some other kids, we all wanted iPads, like
Good time
that's
to
a very
invest.
telling time of like, oh, this is going to be very successful. And so Apple, obviously back then, if you would have just bought Apple, you would have been a
When
very
the first
wealthy
iPhone
person
came
today.
out, I wonder what their
Yeah,
price was.
right. But like to an adult, it was a silly thing. But like to kids, we thought it was the coolest thing ever, right? So I
Mm,
think kids are some of the best like predictors of what's going to be trendy
that's a good
in
point.
the future. So like it just goes back to like be observant and like also pick things that you're like interested in, right? So if you're not interested in oil and gas, then you probably don't want to buy oil and gas companies. But if you're interested in like clothing or technology or AI, you can find like these different names that like you think they make a good product and watch some YouTube videos on basically how to maybe value companies or read charts. If you're looking at charts, there's some helpful charts. It's called the moving day average, and so I think the normal ones are like 10, 50, 100, maybe 200 day. But basically, what that is like it's an average line of based on the stock's history over the last 200 days of where the price should be. And so typically, a lot of people will look at that chart and say, "Oh, if the price is lower than that average, then it's probably a decent deal." And
Yep.
so, like I said, going back to finding good deals, like a lot of people can find good deals, but the psychology flips when it's investing. So a lot of people will like look at a stock that's triple and they'll say, "Oh, I'm going to buy this stock 'cause it's
Because
going
it's
to
going
go up
up.
forever." Right.
Yes.
And so what you want to do is the opposite. You want to look for a company that just
Buy cheap.
got
Yep.
crushed, right? So like,
Mm,
for example, last month, um, I've been keeping my eye on Snapchat, right? Snapchat, at its all time high to where it was down like over 90%.
wow.
And there's a lot of reasons for that, but what I kind of was noticing that like my wife, she uses Snapchat all the time. That's what she stores lots of her photos on. Her
Mm,
siblings all use it. My wife's a little younger than me. But I know that like young people, our generation, like everybody uses Snapchat and they love it and they're like not going to alternatives. So that's interesting. They have a strong customer base.
mm.
Um, and the price was just getting like crushed. It was pretty low. And so I just got to this point. There was a headline that came out that said, "Oh, Snapchat's getting sued." Um, for basically, the whole underage usage or whatever, right?
Oh,
So
yeah,
like
yeah.
young kids who are using it or whatnot. And the price, I got hit pretty hard and I'm just, I had my eye on it for a while, but at that moment I was like, this is just way underpriced. It was too cheap. It was too good of a deal to pass up because we all know that, we all know people that use Snapchat all the time. It's a good company. You can look at their earnings and all this stuff, but so I just went and I bought some Snapchat. I didn't buy the stock. I bought what's called options calls, which is basically
A
you're
prediction.
betting
Yeah.
that the price goes up to a certain point within a time frame. And so if you want to be safe, I bought an option call that expired in 2 years. So basically in 2028 or 2027, I was making a bet that the price would be at this point. And so I had 2 whole years to hold that contract. Um, but what happened was, with everything that happened, like basically the stock just like reversed, it started going back up. And I ended up selling that contract and I was up like 90% in
Yeah.
about a month. Now, that's what you would call high risk because you're talking options. And I don't recommend most people do options.
Yeah.
I certainly wouldn't, but it's just kind of an example of being observant. Like, find some companies that interest you, find some products that interest you, figure out who owns those products and just add them to a watch list. and kind of just keep your eye on them, maybe make some custom price targets. And so that way, if the stock gets hit and it drops below a certain point, you'll know, oh, this could be a good opportunity.
It's a good buying time.
Go read the news, figure out what the reason is. And a lot of times it's just people overreacting. And so, I think that's fun. It's exciting. But if you want to be a less active trader, that's where I recommend, or I don't recommend, but, I personally buy, a lot of cryptocurrencies. I've been doing it for about 7-8 years. And, you kind of just look at some of the top performers, Bitcoin, Ethereum, maybe Solana, maybe XRP. I mean, you look at all the pricing, you look at their technology, do some research, try to avoid the clickbait. You'll have all these crazy price predictions and clickbaits, but try and just figure out, what the actual reason behind the coin is. Bitcoin is probably the most unique. It's a store of value, so it's similar to gold, and so it might be the safest bet long term. And my entire investment thesis for a couple years while I was working was actually just Bitcoin. Like, it was dollar cost average. Every paycheck, it went straight into Bitcoin, and that was a fantastic.
More than 5 years ago.
Fantastic return. No, probably closer to 3.
Okay, still pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, it was around 30 grand or so.
Crazy.
Up to 40 grand, and if the price goes up enough, then sometimes I'll pull back a bit and I'll just hold some cash, and then when the price dips, I'll buy again.
Yep.
But I mean, I was in Puerto Rico like a couple months ago, and like crypto just crashed out of the blue. There wasn't any reason why, but I was looking at it, and Bitcoin dropped below like 60,000. And I've kind of been in this, I'm in this financial place where I don't really have much excess cash because we're paying a mortgage on a house we don't live in and a heat bill, which is sucky when you quit your job and you're making less money, but we made it all work. So, but it was funny because I texted a friend and I was like, bro, you should buy like right now. Cause I mean, the price dropped like, I can't remember how much it dropped. It was like 12 grand in a day or something. I mean, it was a huge drop. And those are the kinds of things that, like, if you ever see that and you're confident on the asset, like, that's when you buy. Like,
buy low.
Those are incredible opportunities, but it's hard to do because psychologically there's going to be fear, and
because you see red.
Yeah,
it's going down.
It's so hard to overcome that. But once you overcome the psychology barrier, that's really where you become a good investor. Like, you can't panic, you can't freak out. Like, you got to be calm. And what I realized and what I tell people, like a lot of people who get into investing, they typically lose money. I lost a lot of money.
Starting out.
I lost everything 3 times, and then the 4th time I hit a home run.
Oh, yeah.
But what I would encourage people to understand is, like, if you can't learn to stomach $100 loss investing, you're never going to be able to stomach $100,000 loss. Because if you want to get to the point where you're a millionaire and your portfolio, shifts and it goes down 10%, and you lose 100 grand in a day, which is very possible. The markets are very volatile these days.
Yeah.
Like, how could, just imagine, like, I mean, I don't know how much money you have, but I'm guessing like 100,000. Like, if you lost 100,000 in a day, you would probably struggle to sleep. I mean, I don't know for sure, but most people would, because they don't have 100 grand. They don't have, like,
it depends on what percentage of the money you have it makes up.
Right. But I mean, to think, like, for me, like, losing $100, like, it's a nothing burger.
Yeah.
And for a lot of people, like, $100, like, I have friends who are like, they make an investment and then maybe it goes down, and then they just like cash out and give up because they can't handle it. Like, they can't handle it. And so a lot of people think everything goes straight up. But it's a vital lesson. Like, and I think the Lord even has us in those situations where we have to, like, it's a deepening of our faith. And so, the Lord might tell us to make an investment that drops right off the bat, and we lose money, and we all of a sudden question, was this a good idea? But maybe it drops 10, 20%, and then it shoots up and doubles, right? And so if you weren't in that position, you miss out. So, life is full of risks. It's full of difficulties. It's full of hardships. And if you're not willing to take a risk, and if you're not willing to have faith and trust, then, the Lord's probably not going to use you, especially to be an investor, because I don't know anybody who's like 100% I win all the time. Like, pretty much every investor will tell you, like, they lose money. They start off losing money. And, everybody has to go through that, and that's how you learn, right? That's how you learn risk management. I know people who have probably, like, they were on a roll. They were taking high risk bets and they kept winning. And then all of a sudden they lost one and they lost it all. And like, you don't understand risk management, which is basically like, you know, you shouldn't be betting all your money over and over and over again because eventually you'll be wrong. And if
Yep.
you're wrong, you don't want to have to start over.
Yep. So diversifying your portfolio a little bit too, not sinking all your eggs in one basket.
Yeah,
I think that if
diversity.
you do lose it, yeah.
Yeah, it's a touchy topic, but I think diversity, like I think it's overhyped. I think that, you know, what I do is I bet big on things I think will be winners, and I don't put all my eggs in one basket typically, but I will say that my basket's definitely heavier on some
Yeah,
areas,
and
but
on more trustworthy assets.
yeah, right. Stuff I'm fairly confident on.
Sure.
But you're probably not gonna build much wealth if you're doing the whole diversity thing. Like
Not the traditional like 80-20.
yeah, like everybody was preaching how the whole I don't know if it's like the 60-40, like bonds to stocks, but it had like its worst performance in like ever.
Bonds
I
are
think a couple
terrible.
years ago because bonds just crashed, right?
Yeah,
So that's
yeah.
your safe investment. So you got to really be alert and be careful and don't just be a safe investor. Like a lot of people are just scared of losing money, but that's another important lesson too. Like, when my kids are growing up, I'm actually going to encourage them to lose money, to go invest, to go make bad decisions because once they understand that, like they learn those lessons early. A lot of these kids, like their parents shielded them and they weren't allowed to spend money, to lose money, to make bad decisions. And they're going to go out and they're going to get married and they're going to have a family. And all of a sudden, this opportunity comes up and they're going to bet all their money on this failure. And then it's going to put their family in a hardship because they didn't learn those lessons prior. Yep. So when you're growing up and you have $20, tell your kid to go throw it at a stock or whatever they're interested in, there's a lot of kids who are flipping money impressively today. Like I talked to one parent of a kid, he's on Roblox and the kid kept asking him for money and eventually he stopped and he's like, asked him again. He's like, hey, just give me this $20 and I won't ask again. So he gave him the $20 and sure enough, he didn't ask again. He talks to his son. He's like, what happened to that money? He's like, oh, let me show you, Dad. And his son turned $20 into $80 flipping assets in Roblox. And so like the kid quadrupled this money in a short amount of time. Like if you step back and think about that, like that kid learned a valuable lesson. Like how many of us could do the same thing, and that's real money too. Like you can actually now pull that money out, convert it to dollars, so we're growing up in an age and in generations where now like kids growing up can play games, they can earn real money, they can make real money.
Yep.
And I think that's actually a really exciting opportunity too. If I had more time, I would definitely be involved in that.
Within safe parental monitoring. But yes.
Oh yeah, for sure. It's great lessons, though.
Yeah, I think so too. So we're talking about cryptocurrency a little bit. I'm in cryptocurrency a little bit later than you. So do you still see the market going up? I mean, I know we're talking about safe assets like Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
Like you still see a future for Bitcoin because mostly the dollar's weakening and we're looking for other stores of value to replace it. So at least Bitcoin seems to me like it has a lot of potential. We don't need to talk time frame, but like you see a future for it. You see a future for other stable coins. I'm just curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think crypto is probably the best wealth building opportunity for young people. And, what most people need to understand, if you're interested in Bitcoin, you have to actually study the whole debasement of currency, which we talk about a lot in this fancy book here. There's actually a whole chapter on it called Silent Debasement, but it basically goes in depth of how the government continues to print money. And over the years, they found this thing, which basically is 7%. So they increased the money supply on average by 7% a year, which is kind of like the gold ticket, because if they do it too much or too little, there's consequences that make it not worthwhile. So what you have to understand is that in this society that we live, like that's the only solution. Like politicians will say, we're going to cut costs, we're going to cut the deficit, but that's never going to happen. They're only going to go further in debt because that's how the system is designed. So where Bitcoin came in, or where Bitcoin comes in, it's a finite currency, right? And so there's only 21 million coins. That's all there ever will be. It's what's called perfect scarcity. It has basically the favorable attributes of gold minus the poor attributes, aka it's easy to move. You can transport across borders seamlessly. It's very cheap to move. It's very cheap to liquidate. For example, in Dubai, while they're getting hit by rockets from out of nowhere in this war, people were selling gold under the spot price, which is crazy because people were basically selling their gold and taking big hits on it because people didn't want to buy it. And so like they were trying to basically cash out their gold so that they could leave the country and go somewhere safe. But to do that, they wanted to like, it's very hard to, you don't want to walk around with $100,000 in gold. It's very risky. So you try to sell it for currency. But the market for, Dubai, like it kind of fell apart for a while because people were trying to get rid of their gold. Right. So the advantage of Bitcoin is it's basically in your wallet, your hardware wallet, so you can go anywhere with it. It's very easy. It's easy to cross borders. And so, there's a lot of interesting attributes that make it valuable. And most people can't understand that. But, once you see and understand real life scenarios, it makes a lot more sense of why you want to have it. But yeah, long story short, what you need to focus on is how much money they're printing, how they're going to continue to print money. And, this administration, whether you like Trump or you don't, the truth is that the deficit, the debt continues to go up and up and up. I think it's going up faster than it was under Biden.
Yeah.
It's crazy because he was supposed to cut all this waste, and now we've added a lot of waste, and we got wars going on overseas and stuff. So
I think people, regardless of where they stand, have noticed that their finances have not improved
Since
since COVID.
It's
Everything's
worse,
been pretty disastrous.
and it won't get better. And so,
Yeah.
this Bitcoin, the store of value, just look at its historical trend. It's been around for, I think, 17 years. And so a lot of people are just calling it a nothing burger, but like to be around 17 years and still have significant value, I think it speaks for itself for a large degree. And it's been the best performing asset in the last decade, basically. So, I think that it's worth researching. It's worth reading a couple books on. I obviously am biased because I buy a lot of it. But crypto is very volatile, and I think it always will be, at least for a long time. So, once again, that's where finding good deals comes into play. So, I was dollar cost averaging every paycheck, but if you're in a position where you can store a little cash on the side, man, we had some great opportunities in the last couple months. The prices have been really low on some good altcoins and crypto. You can kind of pick what you want, but the altcoins will be a lot more volatile, so you'll gain more or lose more. And so it's a very high risk. It's very difficult for most people to stomach the losses, even though you might not sell. But I think that, as far as investing goes, I've been investing for a while. I think that, crypto is it's a lot easier place to make more money on maybe a shorter time frame. The problem is if you buy a coin, you kind of have to wait it out until it becomes favorable to sell, which could be longer than you might expect, right? And so, it's been down for a couple months. I didn't expect it to be as low as it got for as long as it was. And it was unfortunate for me because I kind of had to sell some because I didn't have enough money to pay my bills. So that's the gamble you take, however, in the long haul, it's been fantastic for me. So, it's one of those things where, you kind of just have to sit back. And a lot of young people are doing this. They're looking at like, okay, my financial advisor says I should aim for 7% a year. Like, just start doing the math, like figure out where you're going to be in 30 or 40 years. Like, a lot of people only be around like 1.5 million, 1 million. And like, it sounds like a lot of money, but in that many years, if things continue to go the way as they are, $1 million isn't going to basically buy you a basic house. And so, I think that you need to really, look at your returns. And a lot of young people are buying crypto and they're betting on these riskier assets, or they're doing sports betting because they're kind of realizing that like, their wages aren't going to keep up and their wages aren't going to be reliable to make them wealthier. And so they're looking at their 401ks, but the 401k portfolios aren't really returning much. So then they start looking around for, they're looking for lifelines. Like, how can I basically make some money here because I'm living paycheck to paycheck and I got to get something. So they take riskier, bigger bets. And that's kind of another downside of where we're at as a society. But it's unfortunately become necessary. Like you almost have to take bigger risk and bigger bets, because if you don't, you're going to fall into the lower middle class, which is basically, who knows what that looks like.
Yeah.
It's not good though.
Yeah. So how do you balance that? Like we need to take increased risk, but also not like too much risk to where like a lot of young people have gotten like cheated out of money because they'll put all of their money on some meme coin that everybody says it's going to pump to 100 million tomorrow. And if you go in on it right now, you're going to win big. And then they just sucker them out of all their money. How do you spot, like we are talking about more reliable assets. So crypto is still risk. Like Solana is, the third most popular, or maybe XRP, but third or fourth most popular like of the stable coins. A lot is known about it. It has a history that you can watch and view and like observe. So that's it's still different in asset than like a meme coin, which they often get grouped together when you talk about cryptocurrency to people who don't know what it is. They're just like, you mean the silly frog on the internet? And yeah, and so there's a big difference between like high risk, meaningless, valueless assets where you could make some money potentially. I do know people who've made money on stupid meme coins. So there is that risk, but it's a lot riskier than like a stable but still risk asset like Bitcoin, Ethereum, whatever.
Yeah. So I think, um, I can't remember what's the word called. It's like risk. I can't remember the word. Basically, figuring out how to channel risk, right? And so having, figuring out risk tolerance. And so,
Mm.
a lot of people like it's not a good idea to gamble. Basically, a lot of cryptocurrencies are nothing more than a gamble, and a lot of them are kind of silly money. Like, it's pretty bad when the president's own coins are nothing more than pump and dumps. That's kind of the world we live in, though. And a lot of people bought into those thinking that they were going to return money, but they basically crashed. So, understanding your risk tolerance is vital. And, it kind of just depends on where you're at in life. Like if you have nothing, it makes sense to kind of take higher risks, because if you can win a couple times, it'll kind of get you somewhere, kind of get you to have something. And I think getting some kind of what I call a snowball start is the hardest part of life. If you have nothing, going from nothing to $10,000 it's difficult for most people. But once you get to $10,000, going to $20,000, $30,000, it becomes easier, right?
The rich get richer.
Right. Yeah. The first $100,000 is probably the hardest you'll make in your life. And so if you acknowledge that, it's kind of like a mental barrier that you can overcome. So if you can if you can make 100 grand, you'll be able to make $1 million a lot easier than it was to make 100 grand, which is a radical idea, but a lot of people agree with it. So, where is your risk tolerance? I think that's something that you have to figure out yourself. Like, if you have nothing, maybe it makes sense to say, I'm going to put 50% of my investable money into something that's maybe risky, but more reliable. So, in that case, Bitcoin, Ethereum, those reliable coins. And then maybe you put the other 50% into something that's maybe a higher risk, but higher return. So, if it hits, you might quadruple or 10x your money, which will actually help you substantially. But if it loses everything, you still have, your other stuff going on. But, you just kind of have to play with it and figure out what that number looks like. I wouldn't put much money in those high risk coins. I think most of them, like, you got to be really good at timing, and most people don't have that skill. So if you ride, if you ride Dogecoin up, a significant amount, it's hard to sell. Like I was sitting on a significant amount of Dogecoin and I didn't really sell what I should have sold because I fell under the psychological illusion that a lot of people do. Like, it's going up, it's going to get to $1, it's going to go forever. And you make a ton of money, but if you don't sell, it goes down. Like most of those coins, they don't stay high, and that's kind of what makes them really difficult. So, really with crypto, for most people, they probably should go heavier in the more reliable coins. I think the odds of succeeding in a bunch of the meme coins are very low, and it can be depressing if you lose over and over and over again. And I mean, I think as of recent, there hasn't been much significant movement in those either. Like I haven't really seen many meme coins taking off. Like it's kind of a very shallow place, which means that it's probably a good time to bet on some of them, but I personally wouldn't.
Yeah.
Because it's just not really worth
At
my
least
time.
not very much.
Yeah, and so I'd rather, make a higher risk bet with an undervalued stock or something, I think.
Sure. Cool.
Yeah, but I mean, cryptocurrency is it's a unique opportunity that we all have, and it wasn't around for most of humanity, so take advantage of it, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Because, I mean, you can stake your coins, you can earn yield, you can lend them out. I mean, there's a lot of different things you can do with them. It's a very unique protocol, and so you can buy some coins and move them to a crypto bank and earn interest on them. That's pretty unique. It's like a stacked investment. So, you know, there's a lot
Yeah.
you can do.
Anything else about the death of the American dream? Is there anything else in your book you want to mention or talk about?
Oh, well, let me look here at my chapters. I think we covered every single chapter, which is pretty cool.
Perfect.
Yeah,
That's how it
great.
goes.
So yeah, you guys should all go out and buy a copy. It's very cheap.
Where can people find The Death of the American Dream?
It's on Amazon exclusively because you can publish books on Amazon for free, and it's print on demand, so I don't have to pay anything to publish it. But I'm biased, but I think it's a pretty great read, especially if you're young, if you're trying to figure out your life, if you're trying to figure out what to do with your life, and maybe if you feel like you're working hard, you're putting forth your best effort, but you're not getting anywhere. I just kind of want people to know that you're not alone, that most people actually feel that way, and that the odds are stacked against you. And I think that once you understand how the odds are stacked against you and you apply the proper wisdom towards that, you can actually succeed in life. You can get ahead. You can actually build and find your dream life, which is easier to build than ever before, but you got to run the right direction in order to do it. So.
Yeah. I think that's all I've got, unless you've got anything else to add.
Yeah, it was a good time.
Yeah, thanks for the conversation. I enjoyed it.
Likewise.
It's really good.
Thank you all for watching. Hopefully we'll see you next time. Cheers.
Cheers.